Professor John Rogers.
Thank you. Esteemed colleagues, let me begin with a dilemma. Now more than ever, we need youth who believe in reasoned analysis of social issues, who care for their neighbors and for the public good, and who are empathetic to the most vulnerable members of our society. In short, we need quality civic education. But the same forces that make civic education essential today also make it more and more difficult to enact. This problem is not entirely new. Horace Mann, one of the early advocates for public education, wrote in 1848, "In all nations hardly excepting the most rude and barbarous, the future sovereign receives some training which is supposed to fit him for the exercise of the powers and duties of his anticipated station." Mann argued that in a commonwealth where sovereignty will be enacted collectively, civic education must be provided in common schools open to all. But even as Mann envisioned public schools as sites for preparing citizens to participate in political life, he worried that a fractious partisanship might undermine the democratic project of common schooling. He wrote, "If the tempest of political strife were to be let loose upon our common schools, they would be overwhelmed with sudden ruin. Let it be once understood that the schoolroom is a legitimate theater for party politics, and with what violence will hostile partisans struggle to gain possession of the stage and to play their parts upon it." Today, we see Horace Mann's worries manifest in many public schools across the United States and across the globe. Indeed, many public schools face not only unruly and contentious politics from the broader community, but also the bitter seeds of intolerance as well. Consider, for an example, the case of Linda James, a high school principal in the United States. Ms. James believes that the greatest challenge she now faces as a principal stems from the contentious national politics that stir up turmoil at her school. Linda James recounts sitting in her office during a class period last winter and hearing a loud, repetitive thump, thump, thump coming from the stairwell, causing her to run out to check on the commotion. Once there, she discovered a group of white male students clapping and shouting, "Trump, Trump, Trump," as they descended the stairs. Before she could get to the boys, an African-American student with an anti-Trump message handwritten on his t-shirt stepped into the hallway to challenge them. This counter-protest ignited the boys again to pick up their cadence and their volume, until Ms. James and her fellow administrators, alongside the school resource officer, were able to establish order and begin applying consequences for the pandemonium and disruption of class time. Linda James's students often communicate racially hostile messages to their classmates. Some students feel emboldened to say, "Go back to Venezuela, go back to Colombia, you do not belong here." Such statements carry a particularly menacing force for members of a community that's experienced several recent deportations. Noting that immigrant parents don't like to come to school, they don't like to sign things, Ms. James describes the local Latino community as very much on edge. Against this backdrop of stress, division, and marginalization, Linda James sees little choice but to deflect attention away from politics. Her school has received recognition in the past by ensuring 100% of eligible students are registered to vote. But now, she agonizes that greater political engagement is, quote, "when things fall apart." She's reluctant even to include words like civics and democracy in the school's mission statement. "I don't think our community would tolerate that," Ms. James explains. "We are a very diverse community and we have extremes on both ends." In this political moment, Ms. James does not believe it's her job to get students to understand the other's viewpoints. She concludes, "I don't think anybody's been very good at that." In many parts of the world today, the tempest of political strife leaves educators like Linda James caught between a desire for their students to learn about and practice democracy and a commitment to maintain a safe and caring learning environment. I heard some of these same concerns from a group of principals I interviewed in December in Copenhagen, so this is not just a US phenomenon. Public schools are charged with bringing together young people from diverse backgrounds to learn from and with one another. This project requires students to engage each other with a certain degree of regard and respect. These conditions are particularly important for civic education, in which students learn to deliberate, inquire into social issues, and collaborate on shared projects. Such practices presume extensive social interaction, engagement, and voice. But in doing so, they potentially invite in voices of intolerance that undercut community and safety and threaten not just civic education, but learning more generally. As I said, this is not a new dilemma, but it's acutely felt in a time of rising intolerance and conflictual politics in society writ large. Many nominally democratic countries around the globe are experiencing rising liberalism and populism: Brazil, India, Philippines, Hungary, Turkey, and many more. Roberto Foa and Yasha Munk see signs of a democratic disconnect among wealthy democracies as well. Younger generations, they point out, have become increasingly likely in recent years to view democratic governance as unwieldy and express support for authoritarian regimes. The question then arises, what does it mean to educate for democracy when democracy itself is under threat? In my paper, I looked at John Dewey's writings from the late 1930s, when he was approaching 80, when he took on the threat of fascism to democracy. Dewey wrote, "For a long period, we acted as if our democracy were something that perpetuated itself automatically, as if our ancestors had succeeded in setting up a machine that solved the problem of perpetual motion in politics." For Dewey, democracy is much broader than a special political form, a method of conducting government, of making laws and carrying on governmental administration by means of popular suffrage and elected officers. It is, he said, a way of life in which all people participate in the formation of the values that regulate the living of men together. Dewey's language about the values that regulate the living of men together brings to mind the concept of civility. The concept of civility provides one way of talking about how diverse and sometimes disagreeable people relate to one another. It addresses rules, norms, or standards for living together, and frequently establishes boundaries for what is acceptable or unacceptable. Civility seems like a particularly useful concept to think about the dilemmas of democratic education, because it's often referenced in discussions about deliberation within the public sphere. Yet, as anthropologist Sharika Thirangama argues, civility has an uneasy history. It is sometimes used as a silencing mechanism or as a means for social control. Etienne Balaber shares these concerns about civility imposed from on high. He envisions what he calls bottom-up civility as an emancipatory alternative. Bottom-up civility emerges through the actions of individuals and groups who, because of their lack of power and status, often are the target of incivility. Bottom-up civility aims to clear space for the recognition and dignity of others and place limits on behavior that humiliates and enacts symbolic violence. In the paper, I present 3 cases of high school principals in the United States who adopt different strategies for promoting civility as a way to address the challenges of developing democratic citizens in these difficult times. These principals, like Linda James, who I introduced earlier, are participants in a national study I began in the United States soon after the presidential election of 2016. I'm going to touch upon the first and third case and then say a little bit more about the second case. The first case I call We Are Switzerland. Michelle Kennup is a principal in a very conservative area in the southeast United States. Some of her white students have made aggressive and threatening remarks to immigrant students. Kennup has disciplined students for bullying behavior. She also has advised students not to talk politics at school. She says, "This is a safe space. We are Switzerland. We are a neutral ground because we have to be. We've got too many people coming in with too many backstories, too much history, and if we don't remain neutral, and this is not a safe space for everybody, then it becomes a nightmare for everybody." While Ms. Kennup's strategy may have prevented more nightmares, it leaves students' underlying beliefs unchanged. It's likely that our immigrant students still feel very much on edge. When I asked her whether it's possible both to limit harmful conflict and encourage civic development, Ms. Kennup replied, "It's a very, very delicate line. It's a very, very delicate balancing act, and I'm not going to win right now." Case 2, we've stopped avoiding. Kathy Burton leads a racially diverse school located in a politically contested area in the western United States. Her school straddles the line between suburban and rural communities and enrolls both the children of farm owners, who are primarily white, and of farm laborers, who are overwhelmingly Latino, including many immigrant families. In the last 3 years, Kathy Burton has grown increasingly worried about the effects of national political rhetoric on her students. She describes, quote, "an ugliness about politics that's popping up through the kids." The contentious political climate is particularly hard on Kathy Burton's students who are undocumented, who are with family members who are undocumented. Ms. Burton says that these students are just flat out afraid, and that they or their families will be reported to immigration enforcement officials for deportation. Kathy Burton notes that her school also enrolls a substantial number of white students who are strong supporters of President Trump and advocate vigorous immigration enforcement. At times, tension between these groups has erupted into open conflict. We had quite a day the day after the election. One of our kids had brought a giant Trump sign and stood on a cafeteria table and held it out like, "ha ha." And then one of the students grabbed it and ripped it, and the next thing you know, the kids were at each other's throats. Amidst the melee, a white student in the back of the crowd shouted, send them back," a chant that's often heard at Donald Trump's campaign rallies. While such incidents have been difficult for Kathy Burton, they have not undermined her commitment to fostering civility. She and her staff have resolved to figure out the best way to support difficult political conversations in classrooms. "We've been struggling with it," she says, "so I wouldn't say we have the answers pulled together yet, but we've stopped avoiding the conversation in classes, which is one way to handle it. We decided not to do that." Ms. Burton and her teachers have been working on developing facilitation skills in which students are allowed to speak, even if you disagree, but you have to do it civilly. She wants classrooms to be places where hard topics are not avoided, all viewpoints are honored, and there is a civil tone. Ms. Burton doesn't care what the viewpoints are advanced, as long as students are, quote, "able to articulate that viewpoint in a way that's intelligent and doesn't demean anyone." Kathy Burton believes her teachers are getting better and better at moderating these discussions. She offers the example of a classroom she observed in the last school year. One of the Anglo country kids said, "Well, I just think all the Mexicans aren't helping our country. I just don't think it was a good idea to let them all in to begin with." The teacher did a good job of saying, "I understand that's how you feel, but I want you to look around this room and note that there are people here that could be upset by the way you said that. Can you think of another way to articulate your viewpoint?" By refusing to avoid difficult conversations, Kathy Burton and her staff embrace the challenge of fostering civil exchange in a community riven by division and intolerance. The educators try to influence how students speak rather than shape what they say or believe. They restrain tone rather than substance. This means that educators do not challenge intolerant views as long as they're advanced without overt aggression. It's possible that lowering the temperature of a classroom discourse may serve as a bridge to new forms of social interaction amongst students that will lead to new understanding and tolerance. But that hopeful outcome is in no sense inevitable. While such a strategy may lower the hackles associated with intense conflict, it also allows intolerant views to be normalized within classroom spaces where those views likely accentuates feelings of acute vulnerability for immigrant youth. Kathy Burton worries that her undocumented students, quote, "feel anxious as they walk into this campus and into classrooms," she adds. "They feel a little bit like they walk on eggshells all the time." The case 3 is we do a lot. And this is a case of Principal Anthony Montesa, a principal in a northeastern suburb that's very politically divided. Anthony Montesa is committed to promoting a democratic culture in his building, He says, we have students collaborating an awful lot in the classroom just so that they have opportunities to work with different students and get to know different students. Perhaps even more important than the classroom opportunities is an array of opportunities that are provided across extracurricular spaces. Students are invited to participate in efforts to make the school a more diverse space. Their voices are heard, and in this way, students play a leadership role organizing events, participating in small group discussions. Mr. Montesa says, we do a lot. By creating multiple spaces and abundant opportunities for students to participate in dialogue and collaborate with one another, Anthony Montesa and his staff foster this democratic culture. Mr. Montesa aims to foster deep engagement of students because it supports learning generally as well as civic development. Hence, civic education is inseparable from the core of the school's work. Dialogue becomes a way to address incidents of intolerance. It may be that providing students with a greater sense of agency and responsibility for school culture creates a self-correcting dynamic that fosters deeper understanding among students. We might characterize this approach as creating opportunities for the emergence of bottom-up civility. Yet it's very much an open question as to whether these strategies could take hold in a political community with more entrenched and vocal intolerance. Let me sum up with a couple lessons that I draw for educators and for broader society. First, educators should view civility not as a goal, but as a provisional tool for promoting democracy amidst contention and intolerance. The democratic purposes of schooling should be the focus, not civility per se. It's important that educators reflect continuously on the ways that their enactments of civility either promote or restrain democracy, or a little bit of both. Second, educators should invite members of the school community to participate collectively in this reflection. They should talk about the dilemmas associated with encouraging participation and voice when such efforts may invite vitriol and intolerance. And they should discuss their strategies for negotiating these dilemmas. Such space for reflection and dialogue serves as a check on the problematic manifestations of civility. It builds deliberative habits and skills, and it frames the problem as one the entire school community needs to work on together. It's worth noting one last lesson. The task of enhancing democracy in challenging times cannot solely be the responsibility of our schools. Anthony Montesa was able to build a democratic culture in his school in part because the broader school community was not defined by as much hate as some other communities around the nation. Schools are only somewhat autonomous from the broader societal dynamics. If we want schools to support the democratic development of young people, we must initiate change simultaneously inside and outside of schools. Our challenge now is strikingly similar to what John Dewey articulated in 1938. We now have to recreate by deliberative endeavor the culture and practice of democracy as a way of life. Creative democracy, as he said, remains the task before us. Thank you.